Yes. Brilliant, Leo. Okay. I will remind everyone that the hashtag is GovernEd, and that I will be monitoring it over the course of the questions here, and I will try to get in some. I'd like to begin with one question that invokes the Bible of market reform, Chubb and Moe's Politics, Markets, and Schools, where they say, frankly, and probably in a way that they have since regretted, that the problem with schools in the United States is that they have a system of democratic governance, and that what market reform would do would be to solve that problem. And they attribute to democratic governance all sorts of ills like bureaucracy and lack of innovation. And I wonder, as we're a good decade and a half into those market reforms, if the members on the panel would like to comment on perhaps the relationship between market reform and growing autocratic governance. And also, I think we should probably take note today, after the Newark election, a series of mayoral elections now that have been in significant measure fought over education, from Washington, D.C. to New York City to Boston to Newark, in which in virtually every case, despite rather prodigious amounts of money that were poured in, the electorate have voted for candidates that took positions quite critical of the current market reform. So I throw that open to the panel.
Yeah, I think, I'm not sure. Well, that's why didn't you say this earlier? That was the whole point of my wearing this, is that, see, that's what we need, feistier publics who tell me early that they can't hear me. Thank you. I think, and it's hard to figure this thing out. I think Moe and Chubb might say that markets are a form of democracy. And I think that's the risk we are facing today, is that we're not sure what we mean by democracy, and there is no place in which we can grapple with that idea. So part of my vision of a good school is it's a place that grapples with that. And the most important place to grapple with it is to figure out, how do we govern within this school? Because that is something that you can grapple with not only on the very high abstract level, but also on that midpoint between practice and theory. And you can do that with young kids. I mean, the pilot schools in Boston, which tried to figure out a way to encourage innovation without leaving the public system, have been quite successful. And they have never gotten the support, however, of the new reform movement. I don't mean they didn't get any support. There's a few foundations who found them interesting. And I've always found that intriguing, that efforts to try to figure out this dilemma of giving schools a far greater authority over the decisions that affect that community, and how to, one of the things I didn't get into is how to fit parents into that constituency. Because you can have a faculty-governed school in which parents feel equally disenfranchised. And so how to build it, and I think we have some stunning examples in this country of people who've played with that and succeeded with that, and that very little attention is paid to the incredible efforts that some educators around the country, and there are hundreds of those around the country, isolated, if you will, examples of how people have grappled with the questions that you raise. And we don't, those are not where we're learning from the people who are working it out, parents and teachers. What was that?
Yeah.
So Chubbumo's argument was basically that if you have heterogeneous populations with different values and majoritarian institutions, then those majoritarian institutions will rely on regulation in order to impose the will of the majority on the minority. And so their argument was democratic majoritarianism leads necessarily to bureaucracy, and bureaucracy is the problem in terms of delivery. I would take issue with at least two elements of that argument. One is, I think it was indicative of, and in some ways started, but in some ways just picked up, a tendency to frame the debate around education largely in terms of delivery systems. So schools as delivery systems for services, and leaving aside or dealing too thinly with the role of government and democracies in terms of setting agendas and arriving at public goals. And to the extent that they did attend to that, because they were, political scientists like I am, and they talked more about government and politics than, say, Milton Friedman or many of the advocates of school choice. But to the extent they did, their vision of democratic politics was about preformed values and interests competing. And in that situation, then one side wins and one side loses, and majorities impose their will on the losers. And what that at least leaves out of the picture is what I think is a healthier view of democracy, at least one that I hold, which is that democracy is also about people with different values interacting, trying out ideas, rethinking what their interests are, accommodating, negotiating. And that's the part of the story that is missing in their inevitable, in their mind, linkage between democracy and bureaucracy and overregulation.
We could probably have an entire session just on, and I put in air quotes, market-based reforms, because I think that means different things to different people. I would agree with everything Jeff said, I guess, up into a point. A couple things come to mind here. The first is the charter laws, which got started in 1991, and voucher tax credit programs also in about 1990 in Milwaukee. Especially the charter laws did something remarkable. In and of themselves, they didn't create any schools. They didn't mandate that schools get created. They didn't mandate that kids go to them. What they did is they set up, some would call a fertile field, that enabled people who felt disenfranchised by systems that were democratically controlled by a majority to start schools of their own, and then they would be receptacles of families' kids who might be interested. Well, lo and behold, what someone would call a market system, which I would actually just say was an exit valve for a whole lot of families, led to, at this point, more than 2 million boys and girls deciding to choose a school not run by their local district. And P.S., this is the first year that 1 million kids are on charter school wait lists. This is a non-trivial matter. This is something that even if you're a charter antagonist, a non-charter supporter, that you really ought to think about. How is it the case that 2 million plus another million, and maybe even more if there was more access, would be beating the doors to have other kinds of options? The other thing that I would say as a conservative who got into this movement, one of Chubb and Mo's arguments, and it motivated me to the point where I am right now, where I think they were more wrong on democratic control, because I think, as I gave in my presentation, the sense that there is something important about local ownership of the contours of a system of schools. And I still haven't defined that yet. I think they were probably too dismissive of that. But the thing they got more wrong was the sense that choice is a panacea, and that is actually verbatim from the book. They thought that if you enable choice in the right kind of system, that you would bring sufficient pressures to bear on the system as we know it, and it would lead to this miraculous change. The biggest surprise and the biggest eye-opener for me has been how little this system as we know it has changed due to the competitive pressures of charters and other choice mechanisms. I mean, keep in mind that there are places like Washington, D.C., where nearly 45% of kids are in charter schools. I was in conferences a decade ago where people hypothesized that if we could someday get charter market share in the city at 5%, it will totally flip the system. The district will have to compete and it will get hugely better. You saw the data that I showed. 50% of kids in DC are choosing not to go to district schools, and DC still has the lowest 8th grade reading scores for low-income kids. Detroit has 51% of kids in charters. On all 4 tests in all 4 subjects on NAEP tutored, Detroit is the lowest performing of all 21 cities. Hold on, let me just finish this. Because this is actually a point about market pressures. I now no longer believe in market pressures and competition within the current system that we have. This is why I'm such a much bigger advocate of allowing people to choose and create new schools. I don't think the system as we currently have it will ever bend to these kind of pressures like Chubb and Mo thought they would.
It's not that the system won't. They're not innovative either. I mean, why people don't choose charters because they're more innovative. They choose charters because they're, in fact, more like schools they think were 40 years ago, when scores were also low. I mean, it is not, I know more innovative public schools. I'm not talking about the private sphere now. More innovative public schools than I know innovative charters. And I've visited a lot of charters. They are like all black schools were when I was subbing in Chicago schools. Tough on discipline, silence, top-down scripted teaching, and very little art, music, and the rest. In fact, music was, at least in Chicago, was the one place where there was some of the black schools did incredible work. To call this innovation, you've put your finger on it, though, and you said the original thought, which was, I think, in Shanker's mind also, was that the people would create these schools. The majority of the kids who are in charter schools today are not in mom-and-pop charter schools that were founded by a group of people who were dissatisfied with their local public school. Most of the ones, at least in New York, and as far as I know in Chicago, are by wealthy outsiders. Their boards are made up of people who don't neither live in that neighborhood, send their kids to public schools. It's astounding. They've gone to an extreme of pushing out. And in fact, it's not surprising to me. If you talk to a lot of the charter people I know, including some of my friends, they say, well, you know, these kids come from terrible neighborhoods, and they have terrible families who've destroyed them, and, you know, so we certainly can't include them. What we need are experts who can have a longer school day so they spend less time with their family. Ideally, I went to a meeting where they were talking about, much of Wall Street people were talking about taking over army bases and that were no longer in use, and sending low-income kids there so they can be taken away from their neighborhoods and their families. So they certainly had no interest in the neighborhood and families getting together and starting schools. That is not the charter movement that succeeded in getting long waiting lists. And by the way, the waiting list question is such absurd. If you sign up for 10 schools, that's counted as 10, right? So how many people are actually on a waiting list? You have no idea how many public schools in New York City, kindergartens, have very long waiting lists because we have disinvested in New York City's public schools. You know, at one time you knew you could get your kid into the local kindergarten. Today, there are probably as many kids in public schools in New York who are on waiting lists as there are charter schools. The school next to where I used to live in New York has literally, you can live in the neighborhood and still not get your kid into that school.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna, it's hard to hear because I know that these conversations happen, right? Because the conversations that Deborah talks about, and that I know that there are people out there that are extremely wealthy that are talking to folks who have never been educators in their lives, but see an opportunity to make money off of children, to utilize the harms and the disinvestment in their communities and the stories and what they see constantly reported on TV and they read about over and over again because there's always books written about us in our communities, who they're talking to about, see, if we could just do this, these kids would be this. And it hurts because it hurts and it makes me angry, right? So, I mean, clearly around this market reform, I don't know Chubb, I don't know Mo at all. I doubt if they know anything about me or anybody and people in my community and what we're facing daily and day after day. But what I do know and what I see is that market reform doesn't even connect to me when I'm thinking about education as a parent. What does that mean? I'm thinking stock market. I'm thinking, Goldman Sachs. I'm thinking that doesn't connect to me as a parent in regards to education. So why should I think that is going to help? Because clearly it has not. So when we talk about what charters were supposed to be, these models of innovation to scale up, and I guess the debate is on whether they're being innovative or not, which is not necessarily for me to say. But what happened to that? How do we become now a place where instead of creating a great school system, we want to create a system of schools, right? And that parent and community input is not really valued. It's become a farce. The parents in New Orleans, they don't want charters like you would want them that they would have you believe. They're fighting tooth and nail every day. We don't want our school to be a charter. Their voice is not heard. So when we talk about being blessed by the state, give me a break. Some of the assembly people and senators that are sitting in places now are people that we didn't necessarily want in there. So to get blessed, like to use that word to me is very, it's scary because I know I've been up in Albany fighting those very legislators saying with other parents, we don't want this, we don't want this. So they didn't necessarily get blessings from anybody in regards to the people they represent. And so when we have these conversations about market reform and what we want to do in education, I have to go back and say that if we're not talking to the parents and community most impacted by these policies, then they're not going to work. Why? Because year after year, decade after decade, we've had things done to us, put upon us, people thinking they know better than us. And so we realize that no one values that. The system that was there before, the testing that was there before, guess what? It was supposed to get our children prepared for college. It hasn't. Now let's try another system because this one's really going to work for your kids. Trust us. We know. When you just heard a parent on that film talk about, Governor Colbert, yes, my 16-year-old is now in jail. Black male, special ed. It worked. Right? So what are we really talking about here? I mean, it really is about respecting the values, respecting the space of public, but also respecting the parents and community members and educators and students who go to those schools or live in those communities as valued people and they great thinkers, and they can articulate what they want very clearly, and they can tell you when they don't want it, but guess what? No one's listening when they say they don't want it.
So why don't we, there's a microphone right there if you wish to ask a question. I think it'd be a good time to go to the audience.
Ruth Jordan, and I have, oh yeah. See it? Hello? Hello. I think it's very odd in this discussion to be against bureaucracy and then impose some of the most bureaucratic systems that you could possibly impose. It seems such a strange thing. Here you have a system where you're going to have a central testing system that almost everybody will adhere to, and a central syllabus that almost everyone must adhere to. And increasingly, I notice, even in my local public school, kids are wearing uniforms. I think, wait a minute, what happened here? This isn't democracy, and this isn't public. This is an increasing bureaucratization of the system. And if you thought you were escaping bureaucracy, I would suggest you are imposing bureaucracy.
No, I was just even thinking about the idea that private corporations are not bureaucratic. I mean, try getting through to the telephone company or something these days, and if you can follow those complex instructions about when you push 2, 3, 4, then the person who gets on the phone barely able to, has a script. That's not, I mean, and it wasn't in some golden age that AT&T and so forth used to be friendly family telephone service.
I don't think I made the case against bureaucracy, so I'm sort of having a hard time getting traction here. Like, I don't rail against bureaucracy. I just like good results from schools, and if they get it by being lean and mean, so be it. If they get it by having, like there are some charter management organizations that are much more top-heavy than others. I care about outputs, how kids are actually doing, and I do believe in state standards. I do believe in state assessments because I think because we spend now approaching $1 trillion a year as Americans on K-12 education, we probably ought to know what's being taught, what kids know and are able to do at the end of school years in major subjects, and we assess them to figure out if they're growing or not. Remarkably little, actually. People... Yeah, how much of our current $800 billion on K-12 education is spent on assessments? A really good scholar named Matt Shingos at Brookings recently looked into it, and his argument actually is, given how important assessments are, the paucity of money that we spend on them, there's a big delta there, that if we're going to use them as a way we ought to spend more on them to make sure they're higher quality.
If we spent more on them, we would have schools more like ours in which we have assessments that are judgments by adults and communities on the work of the students. To have fallen for this idea that test scores are a way to know your children. I have 3 children. Some of you have children too. Would you really say that the test scores was the best judge about whether they were going to be successful human beings, whether they were going to improve American life, whether they were going to be good for the common good, or anything that we as a nation care about?
Well, you brought up Exeter and Andover earlier. They sure as hell take a look at test scores when they're deciding which kids get to go in.
Yeah, that's so they can look good.
So they are an indicator, at least to the esteemed institutions that many people in here love.
For the same reason, because they don't interfere with who they want to get. That is, they, on the whole, will help them claim that they do it by merit. Now, first of all, it's not even true. They take in lots of kids whose parents are wealthy and make big contributions, alumni. So sometimes in order to prove that they're not like that, they give tests which more or less correspond to who they want to take in. So no, I don't think that's a good answer to what a well-educated person. I do not think that the average Harvard student, there's a study, what's her name? Guinier did about the higher your test score is on an LSAT as a lawyer, the less it corresponds perfectly to the amount of time you will give pro bono service, but in reverse. It depends what you're measuring and how you're measuring it. And for us to have gotten stuck on defining an education for democracy, for a democratic culture, by test scores is the most absurd.
You and I agree on that. I probably think that tests are more important than you do, but we agree that tests are good at measuring a thing. They are certainly not good at measuring all the things that schools ought to do.
And if we want to spend money, I'm just saying, the way we assess kids at Mission Hill and Central Park East Secondary School and many, many hundreds of other schools in this country is by actually looking at performances that capture what a historian, if you want to look into history, for the purpose of making wiser judgments, does a student begin to have the kind of habits of mind that will enable them to use history usefully as an adult. Now, and they have since judgment is at the heart of a good education, they use judges to judge the student work, not a machine. I remember when my son, who got a poor score in his 3rd grade reading test, although he was a fluent reader, was startled to discover that they were not, he said, I write little notes when I know they might disagree with me, that I chose D and they think C. And he said, I know they would think C, but I chose D. And so I said to him, he's 8 years old, but they don't, what makes you think they read those comments? No, what makes them think, you think they would know your reasoning? And he said, I write a little note. And I said to him, you know, this is not scored by someone who can read. It's scored by a machine. And he said, Mike, I mean, he was so stunned that his wonderful notes that he had written all these years had been ignored.
Is this microphone on? Okay. I'm Mary Levy. By trade, I am a lawyer of education, finance, and civil rights. By occupation, I study the DC public schools. My children went through them. I've been up in arms for 35 years. And I found myself agreeing with almost everything that both Zakiya Ansari and Andy Smerick said. And I said, how is this? and Deborah Meyer hit upon some very important points with the dilemma I think we face, which is we don't really have anything much democratic in either our DC public school system or the charter schools, particularly since the franchises are moving in and displacing the mom and pop schools, which were started by people who really did care about kids and were frustrated with the bureaucracy. The DC public school administration talks as though A, the public is the problem, and B, school autonomy is the problem. My question then is mainly for Jeff Hennig. Parents are frustrated, particularly the low-income parents. They are just excluded from any meaningful respect or attention. How do we get anybody to respond? When we overthrew a mayor who was that way, elected a new one who turned right around, bowed to the big money, and kept everything going the way it was. How does the public get back in?
So let me suggest, because we're running short on time, I'm going to take all three speakers and then give everybody on the panel their last shot, okay?
Hi, my name is Linda Guidi. I'm currently at the National Board, and I just had a couple of questions about community schools, and given our incomes, our neighborhoods rather are increasingly segregated again, resegregated again. What ideas are there out there for what we think of as community schools? I know Liz Davis yesterday went on this fabulous tour in Baltimore of community schools. There was this amazing article last year in the AFT Educator about knowing that what works in schools is having a mix of demographics. So how do you reconcile the idea of having a mix of demographics in a community school, and who's doing it out there? Andy, I hate to glom on, but can you give me a personal, real-life example of a minority family that's been empowered by more choice? 2 questions.
Hi, my name's Steve Wojciechowicz. I do teacher prep policy here for the AFT. I'll be brief. It seems like that markets are very good at efficiency but not equity, that the market-based ideal is of individual choice versus democratic public voice. And I'm curious if it will be possible for market-based reform to ever create not winners and losers, not good schools and bad schools, but an excellent education system for everyone.
Okay, that should give everybody enough to chew on. You want to start, Jeff?
Okay, and since Mary directed her question to me, I'll try to take that on, although it's a tough one. So her question was how do you get back into, if not the driver's seat, at least into the car, folks who feel excluded by both the traditional governmental institutions and the market alternatives that are out there now. And so this won't be a surprise, I guess. I said before, I'm a political scientist, so I think the answer is politics. It's not system design. I think systems designs are relevant. I think it matters whether you have elected school boards versus mayoral control. I think it matters whether you have ward-based elections versus at-large elections. I think whether elections are held at the same time as a general election or separately, I think those things matter. But what we've learned from the last 2 decades is they're not the end of the story at all. What's the end of the story? It's mobilizing people to participate in the political process around the vision and forming, since there are many competing divisions, it's forming viable coalitions, and then it's holding them together. So what we've seen in places like DC, this may or may not be the story in New York with de Blasio. It may or may not be the story in Newark with the election yesterday, which is you can bring these coalitions together for brief periods of time, and if the timing's right, you can shift the regime. But whether you can sustain those over time is the new challenge. But that's where I think the energy has to go.
So 2 things I'll touch on real quick. One is the parent piece as well, which is, in DC specifically, we have Empower DC, which we work with, and they're part of the Journey for Justice Alliance. And so I think connecting to community-based organizations that are local, wherever they are locally, really helps to connect parents who normally might not be advocates to parents who are, but they're parents that look like them and probably live in the same community as they do. I think showing them other parents that have had success pushing back against kind of these either market-based reforms or just pushing back against cuts or whatever it is, who have been advocates. So the Coalition for Educational Justice, we have a 33-minute film called Parent Power, which chronicles 15 years of parent organizing in New York City. And I think it helps to show that there is a way to push back against those who are not, either funding something in their community and or making their schools better. And I think also get their stories out there. Their stories are what shifts and change. They need to be going to visit to, Capitol and tell their stories about what's happening in their schools and their communities and how they do feel. And building those relationships, I think, are really important. And then quickly on the segregated communities piece, I think, for me, I struggle with, is segregation the problem, or is it that we believe that schools that have predominantly Black and brown children are not going to be successful? And if we're honest to say that we think that if they're all Black and Latino, there's no way the school can be successful, then that's a bigger issue to me. Because what we know is that what we're seeing is in communities, especially in New York City, I'm sure around the rest of the country, is the gentrification. And so folks are coming in, and now your housing is not affordable anymore. Can't afford to live there. Guess what? You leave, you exit, and then the community doesn't look like it was before. So I think we need to really question whether it's the segregation, or is that we think, or has it been the perception and the historical perception is that if those kids are all the same color and they all live in one community or a race or whatever, that they're not going to be successful. And I would tend to think that it's the latter.
So 2 related thoughts. The first is on, just as a cathartic moment here, I'm struggling deeply with the question that I never thought I would struggle with because I just didn't think it was an issue, and it's as follows. In urban America, in an urban school district, is it just for there to be magnet schools? Is it okay for there to be some selective admissions high schools? Is it okay for us to say that there are some schools that we know that they are there largely because the community wanted to keep white, more affluent families in the city to give them options, knowing full well that they are test-based, and we know that there are certain kids who can't go to those schools, and that if you were to look at the demographics of the kids who don't test in those schools, it would not shock any of us that there's a pattern there, shall we say. That leads me to something even more uncomfortable, which is it fair to have neighborhood residentially assigned schools in urban America any longer? Is it okay, just like I have trepidation about saying we might not have selective admission schools in an urban area, is it okay to say that if you have enough money to move into Northwest, you can buy your way into a leafy suburban school that everyone likes, but a kid who lives in Anacostia who doesn't have that money can't go to that school? So what I'm wrestling with right now is, in this urban school system of the future, what is the place for both residential-based neighborhood schools and selective admissions, particularly high schools? In other words, is it okay to tell some kids they can't go to some schools? To the more specific question, about are there low-income families who feel empowered by choice? Frankly, I mean, the question, I'm just incredulous, so maybe you and I are coming from different viewpoints on this. By state law, for a century in most places, compulsory education laws have dictated that families send their kids to school. We have known for generations that because we have residentially assigned schools, that we know that if you live at 123 Maple, you have to send your kid to JFK Elementary, King Elementary, Jackson Elementary, whatever it might be. If that school were unsafe or persistently underperforming, we had the strength of law to tell you you had to send your kid to school and you had to send him to that school. That's the kind of thing that makes me wake up in the morning and like want to picket. Like, that is so unjust that we knew that we were telling kids they had to go to schools that we would never in a million years send our own kids to. And so the question is, who is empowered by choice? The millions of low-income families who couldn't move to Northwest DC, who couldn't pay for private schools, and now suddenly have a range of public school options or private school options via voucher tax credit programs, who can decide for themselves what schools they're going to go to. Those are the folks who are empowered. If you need data on this, there are plenty of research studies on both voucher and scholarship parents on the influence their schools are having on them, but the best I've ever found is the Georgetown University DC Scholarship Qualitative Study. There was a study done on whether or not test scores got better, but the more interesting one was what is the influence that having choice has on you as a family? And the results took my breath away. In year one, when a family had never had choice before and they were given choice suddenly, the kind of choices they made were not surprising. But after years 2, years 3, years 4, now suddenly when they were empowered, when they got to decide over the fate of their kids' education, the level of sophistication that they developed, the level of ownership over their school system and their schools went through the roof. Who's empowered? Poor families are empowered.
Actually, by the way, who decides is not up to the parent. It's up to the school who chooses, who agrees. So just reminding you, you know.
Not in charter schools.
No, yes, in charter schools. You think it's an accident that some kids get kicked out of the charter schools and others don't? Or it's an accident that they never seem to take in children with special ed needs or foreign? I mean, it can't be an accident. They send brochures out to some neighborhoods and not to other. They follow up in different kinds of ways. You know, I'm a school person. I know how to get the population I want. And now, it's a dilemma, though, because I feel the same way about this choice question that you do. It seems unconscionable that they should tell me that I live on this side of the street, so I should send to that school, which is fairly progressive, and not to this school, which is fairly authoritarian. No, I agree with you, but I think what we need, this is part of the complexity of democracy, and we have to agree that there's going to be a lot of injustices at times, and the question is which is greater and which is less as we struggle this out. We are not going to have all excellent schools in America as long as we have very poor people and very rich people and people with a lot of influence and people with little. It's just not going to happen. We have to tackle some other issues besides what's the best governance system for schools. We have to think about the governance system of the states and the localities and the United States. District 4 was an incredible example. They figured out a way to have both neighborhood schools. You could always get your kid into your neighborhood school, and you could also get your kid into an equal number of schools of choice. And in fact, the neighborhood schools, if they had space, also became schools of choice. But the whole area was only about a square mile. So that they were all going to neighborhood schools. They were all under the same district authority, and they were all union members. And yet you had choice. Now, I find it amazing how little was learned from that experience. How could that not have been an extraordinary experience? And there were conservatives, the Manhattan Institute, who for a while were very fascinated by District 4. But there's something that they don't like about pilots and District 4s, and I think one of them is that they're unionized. And that another issue here is, having gotten rid of most private unions, we're stuck we. Some people in this country think now the time has come to get rid of the public ones too. I think there are a number of agendas here that conflict. The National Board, was that what the National Board that you referred to? Do you mean the National Board of Professional Teaching Standards? No. Who was it? Who? Was that the National Board of Professional Teaching Standards? Oh. Anyway, there was an organization called the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards, which tackled about 30, 40 years ago, I'm trying to remember exactly, we tackled the question of how can we define good teaching and create a way of identifying who's a good teacher. And we spent millions of dollars, and it was a largely teacher-run project. And I'm intrigued that it is not part of the conversation anymore. I mean, it just intrigues me what gets picked out and what gets disappears. The same thing about desegregation. I mean, you know, I remember sitting in a Harlem school with kids and explaining to them the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And as I said it to them, they were Yeah, it was an entirely black student in my kindergarten. And as I'm looking at them, I'm thinking, now, what exactly? I'm telling this is about the South, you see, that they, and they didn't say anything to me to question me about it, but they should have, and I should have. I went to Boston. I mean, we had a very bureaucratic approach to desegregating schools. Looking back at it, I think the decision was not wrong, but the implementation of the Brown versus Board is a piece of what we're doing now. A single judge in Boston who knew nothing about education decided how it was going to be implemented, and he chose a way which would drive any parent crazy, black, white, or any other. You know, he decided to bus everybody, but mostly black children. Any case, we keep making a mistake that I think is essential, and that is who is hurt and who gains remains the same each time we have a new popular reform. I think choice is lovely. That's why I'm a progressive educator, because I think children should learn how to make wise choices. And that's why I'm for schools being places where we learn about how to make judgments. That's the exercise is how to use what you've learned to make wiser judgments. And I find it interesting that on the whole, the schools that the people who promote choice think are best for black kids are schools in which children have zero choices, and parents have zero choices once they get into those schools, and teachers have zero choices. They are the most top-down, authoritarianly run schools. And I think if choice is so wonderful, we want people to get in the habit of thinking they should be able to make choices and they should know how to weigh choices, that it's odd to me. What we're hoping to do, I think, as best we can, is improve the odds, right? To make it a little more likely in every area of American life that kids will get justice when they go to court, that kids will get justice when they go to a school, and some things improve the odds. And I haven't made a central argument about the magnet schools, but I actually find tracking in all of its forms, which is what we're talking about. Right. Stuyvesant, I think, took in 7 kids out of 1,000 last fall who were black. You are teaching those 1,000 kids something that is not going to make them good citizens of this country we love. And we can make the odds more likely, or we can make the odds less likely, but it takes lots of changes in connection with each other, a network of changes to have the kind of transformative impact that we would like.
And I think that's a good place to end our panel. I'd like to thank all 4 panelists. I think there's a lot to think about in what they said. And I would like to remind you all to tune in for our June panel on educational justice and school integration. Thank you.
Last paragraph.